So for those who don't know me, my name is Mark Ferguson. The neXtgen team on the line, Orla, who's you've just heard from, and Darren Gordon, who's in Hamilton. Orla and I are both in Christchurch. Might just get everyone to mute their microphones. If everyone can do that, then we won't have too much interference. You just need to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. Right, I think we're good to go. I think most people have background noise disappeared. So welcome to today's webinar or video conference, whichever way you want to view it. So Mark Ferguson from neXtgen Agri. Just an opportunity tonight to run through some basics around breeding bees, and I guess a bit of a controversial topic around the trade-off between, or I guess a bit of argy-bargy between tradition and breeding bees, and really wanting to embrace that subject and have a good discussion. Plan to go for about an hour. I got about 30 minutes of material from me, and interjected amongst that will be some questions, I'm imagining. Keen to hear your questions as they come up. It'd be good if you could use the chat box. So if you scroll down you just take your mouse down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat option come up. You can go to chat and put a question in there, and hopefully we'll see them and we'll try and answer them as we go. It'll give you an opportunity to chat with other people online. So we've got, it's great to have, we've got quite a few of our members and clients online. We've got quite a few of people who have signed up to some of our courses. So welcome to all of you. Some of you have been to our Head Shepherd conference we had a few weeks back, which was fantastic. So thank you to all you online. And we've got some new people that we haven't seen before. So great to have you as well. We've, even before COVID-19, we were moving towards doing more of this online type aspect. So did give us a bit of a push to move in that direction. We were going to do this as a webinar, but I thought it'd be good to have a bit of interaction as well, but we'll see how we go. So that's the plan, and we'll get into it. I think we've got, mostly Australians and Kiwis, and maybe one or two others, so welcome. So one question to get the chat going, I'd like you to answer this question in the chat box if you can, so that'll get the system warmed up. And so the question is, are you making genetic gain? And a subsequent question to that is, how do you know? How can you prove it, I guess? So if people want to jump on the chat, I'll keep moving as we do that. But if you want to whack in your name, where you're from, and whether you think you're making genetic gain, that'd be fantastic. And how do you prove that? So that might be, yes, I'm making genetic gain because my average fleece weights go up every year, or my weaning weights go up every year, or if I'm on breeding bees and I've got a very good genetic gain graph that turns up every couple of weeks from sheep genetics. So if people could jump in the chat and start doing that, that'd be fantastic. So I've got a couple coming through. So we've got Emma from Bathurst saying, hopefully, visual classing fleece measurements and just start on some weights. Will Murray stirring up his cousin. And Chad Taylor's come through with yes, because he's got genetic gain graphs on his breeding bees. So yeah, keep that coming through. That'd be great. Karis's weathers aren't giving her much genetic gain, which is fair enough. I'm sure your father is making some genetic gain there, Karis. I was sort of preparing for tonight and came across this quote, which I thought was quite apt for the discussion I was keen to have, and that is, without tradition, art is a flock of sheep without a shepherd. Without innovation, it's a corpse. And so I guess that was the conversation we really want to have, is that both are really important in all that we do in agriculture. We don't want to lose the art and the skills that have come through from generation of farming some pretty tough conditions in right across Australia and New Zealand for various different reasons. It's there's been a lot of hardship, and a lot of people done amazing things with the livestock that they've bred through those times. So obviously we don't want to lose that, but we also want to keep innovating and keep moving as we go to breed into the future, and we face new challenges. But we also have, I guess, great new tools which we didn't have 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 years ago, when a lot of those sort of when a lot of the great sheep breeders were doing their thing, there wasn't the amazing tools that we have today. And so I'm sure if they were around today, they'd be loving the fact of the things that we get to do as sheep breeders and people that work with sheep breeders. We are obviously very fortunate to have the great systems in place across breed plan and sheep genetics in Australia and sheep improvement over here in New Zealand. There's amazing tools that we get to play with, which really have come a long way in the last couple of decades. So I just want to give a bit of background on about me, because some of you don't know me that well, and even the people that do know me pretty well probably don't know the full story. And I just wanted to, because it sort of sets the scene a little bit for these two webinars, because I haven't always been addicted to breeding values and really focused on data. I've come from quite a journey, and it started in northwest Victoria at Hopetoun, which is where my brother still farms, and my parents. And my brother's family are all still farming there. And so it actually started when I was about 11 or something, my addiction to breeding, when we bought the neighbours' Angora goats. And I don't know how many people know much about Angora goats, but they are the most prolific fibre producers there is. And so I became in love with natural fibre production from mohair rather than from wool. But then I have sort of merged that in merino wool over the last sort of couple of decades. But as part of that, we ended up in South Africa, and a whole heap of broken English messages across the seas, to ended up buying that fantastic looking animal there, and bringing out embryos to Australia. So a whole journey of breeding Angora goats back sort of as a kid, and then into early career. And I guess I wanted to put him up because he's obviously a show-fed, show ribbon winning sort of animal, and ended up being relatively productive as well. But just wanted to, I guess I've spent quite a bit of my junior years in the show ring, preparing animals and judging animals across all the national shows in the Angora goat scene. So certainly, and I guess got a real passion for structure and type from that background. My brother and I also started a Pole Dorset stud, from pretty much founded on Venyanong West, which is Trent Carter's wife's parents, which we got our first few sheep from, and my brother's still right into that. But yeah, so a background in terminal sheep and Angora goats is sort of where my journey started, which was quite different to where we are today. But then there's been a whole heap of things that have sort of shaped my interest in sheep and passion for breeding great sheep. And Darren Gordon's online, and he was responsible for walking around many pastures doing the Lifetime Wool project, which became Lifetime Ewe Management, which is one of the biggest, has the most impact of any extension campaign, probably at least in the last decades. And so in doing that, we started to see sheep that would handle conditions completely differently. So we'd have sheep we had to have a whole heap of things a whole heap of nutritional treatments that used to put sheep under a fair bit of pressure, and we'd see sheep that would actually handle that quite well, and other sheep that wouldn't handle that at all. And that really piqued my interest in what was going on. And so I looked up a guy called Norm Adams in Western Australia, and went and studied with him at did a PhD at Murdoch University, but he was at CSIRO, and was really lucky to come across Norm and his team over there, and an amazing set of scientists that I got to work with. Loved my time over there working with Merino Tech WA a lot. We used a lot of their sheep and Belandry, Bill and Case Hanlons and Jeff and Emma. So I was really fortunate to work with those great sheep breeders, and really got interested in merino sheep through that. I really focused on merino sheep through that. I was then a project manager of the Sheep CRC, which we looked at a project which was looking at matching genes to environment. So I got really interested in that aspect. And sort of out of that, ended up getting the first Bred Well Fed Well written and funded by AWI and MLA to start with. And so I think there's 4,500 producers have done Bred Well Fed Well in Australia now. So great to see that material. And a lot of that material, the genetic material out of that, came from my PhD, and a lot of the nutritional material out of that came from the Lifetime Wool project. And pretty much those two things covered most of the material that was in Bred Well Fed Well. So it's great to see that program continuing. While I was doing that, I wrote the Guide for Ram Buyers book that has so that's still available. It's not a bad read to go through all individual traits. It needs probably updating now, but it's still good. Then from WA, I did a bit of lecturing at Murdoch University, and worked out I wasn't very good at dealing with undergrads. And then got offered a job New Zealand Merino company, which is a wool broking company here in New Zealand, and moved over here to mainly lead the work around breeding, developing a breeding value for foot rot. And so it's been fantastic the last few weeks to see that work hit the analysis finally. So it's now just a standard breeding value within sheep genetics. So that's been a 7-year journey, which is with a lot of support, and we've covered that separately, but it's fantastic. And about 2.5 years ago, I started NextGen Agri to, I guess, do all the things that I like doing, and that is sheep breeding, technology, and running science projects. So there are 3 things that we kind of do within NextGen Agri. We have clients across all of New Zealand and Australia, most states in Australia, working directly with those stud breeding clients and commercial clients. So quite the journey. And I just took a bit of time tonight to cover all that, because it does give a bit of background into the next couple of webinars, and a bit about sort of why we sort of do some of the things we do, and why we're interested in and what we're interested in. How we going? We got any questions on the chat, or anyone want to unmute and ask a question, or are we all good? It's all right, a few technical difficulties. I love this quote. So you'll hear a lot of quotes out of me, but knowledge is power is a quote that I use a fair bit. And I think that's the way we approach sheep breeding. The more we can understand, and we don't ever pretend, none of us pretend to understand everything. But the more we get to understand, the more information we've got, the better we go, essentially. And so the more knowledge we can gather and more we can understand about the sheep and the cattle that we're breeding, the better we go. It doesn't mean you have to use all that information, but what we've seen over the last couple of decades is the more information we've got, the more accurate we can select animals, and the better we can go. I use this number a fair bit, which I would normally ask you what that means, but I'll just go straight to it tonight because of our forum. But 30 times is roughly the number of times that people get to make a genetic decision on their farm. Before that, you're coming into the business, and after that, someone's taking you out of the business. I see Georgia Urquhart there, who's taking her father out of the business sometime. So 30 times is roughly the number of times you get to make a decision. And I bring that number up because it's not that many times. You think about the number of times we get to buy bulls or rams or ewes if you're buying in ewes. It's not that many times to actually make a genetic decision. And so I guess I bring that number up because it means that we should actually spend a fair bit of time, or enough time, making that decision, because we don't get to make many of them. And I think it's a really important decision. Obviously, if we had $1 to spend, you'd spend it on nutrition. I'm not pretending that genetics is the first thing in your business, but it is something that's important, and it compounds over time. And so it is something we should focus on. Give it its due time. Any questions or comments yet? And this is something I think about quite a bit, is when I think about sort of tradition in sheep breeding and cattle breeding, and think about how there was a lot of innovation back in the day, and some of that stalls in different studs or different breeding programs. And I often wonder why, and this is my take on it, and I'd love to get some comments or some questions. But I think what has happened in the past is there's been some really innovative breeding. If you read any of the books on the sheep industry or the cattle industry, some really innovative people that had to import scales from the UK, or pig scales from the UK, to measure stuff, and really fought hard to start to do things differently. But had to break away from, I guess, traditional wisdom and more have crossed in different breeds to achieve something differently. So there was some innovation that happened, and that led to success and then market share. And then you get this consolidation period where everything's going well. You're selling lots of rams or bulls, and all is going well. And then at some point, either through generation changeover or through just time, it sort of shifts to a process of, we can't do anything differently because we have to protect what we've got and preserve what we've got, and starts getting, and what I see happening is then innovation sort of starts to drop off because of the position that's held in the industry. And then obviously the next thing that should happen and does happen in some circumstances. There's another wave of innovation happens. Obviously, for the industry, what we want is people to consolidate and then innovate again and go again. And I think it's interesting to think about the cycle of what happens, and it's not unique. It's not unique to our industry or the agricultural industries. I don't know if people remember Nokia phones. It's not that long ago, but you look at their turnover and their operating profit back in the 2000s. Back in 2007, they had 50% of market share. They didn't obviously run fast enough at the smartphone new innovation that was happening. 2007 is obviously when the iPhone turned up and put a lot of pressure on the incumbent, and they didn't change. And there's the same stories for Kodak. The same story is for Blockbuster Videos. All of those had the innovation, had the solution, and didn't run with it. And so after only 5 years after the iPhone, Nokia were in the red. And so amazing how across industries it's not that hard to get disrupted if we don't keep innovating and don't keep using the tools. And so I guess over my time in the industry, and no one will have missed this, I suppose, there is a bit of argy-bargy out there around breeding values are good or breeding values aren't so good, and we see, depending on which camp you're in, and we get put in camps regardless of whether we choose to or not. We see people saying, well, people that use breeding values end up ruining the structure, and other people saying, well, people that don't use them don't have productive enough sheep, or whatever the various arguments are. But I guess the point of tonight was really to have a chat about the fact that that's not actually that useful for us to be fighting like hippos, or for different camps to be not in complete agreement. I think there is room for both. I guess good sheep breeding principles plus using the data to actually incorporate that and move forward with those sheep. And I guess we've been really fortunate in New Zealand to work with a whole heap of, or in New Zealand and Australia, to work with a whole range of sheep production types. And so we get to work with people who have really, I guess, what would be deemed as traditional views on what a sheep should look like. But we can still apply the tools, still apply breeding values to that situation, and end up making genetic gain on those animals within the desires of the people whose sheep they are. And I think that's the really important thing, is that we don't get to decide. We shouldn't be arguing about what our breeding objective is. We can have a discussion about how we use the tools best to achieve that breeding objective, but we shouldn't be in the pub arguing about whether you should have ultra fine wool or super fine wool, or spinners type or bulk cribbing wools, or Angus versus Herefords, or IMF or not, or White Suffolk versus Port Dorset. It's up to the individual and to decide what type of sheep or cattle they want to breed. I guess where I think the argument gets a bit confused is when we sort of get the tools or the breeding value confused with the desired outcome, because they can be applied to any trait that's important to you and to your breeding program. Pretty much everything on a sheep or cow is heritable. There's very little that's not. If you want to select for it, you can make gain, and that's, I guess, the great fun that we all have is that opportunity to really breed a sheep or cattle that are actually by your design. And I think that's the exciting part. How are we going for questions or comments? So we've got Darren who's saying it's an age thing. You go hard and get something happening, you get happy with that, and then you age and start to lose your drive and get skeptical. So yeah, there is certainly that, and it happens at not necessarily just age. It happens like companies get old as well. Any other questions? Anyone want to unmute and make comment?
You there, Ferg?
Yeah, well.
So what's driven the reason that breeding values have given the industry a bad name in some areas?
What do you mean by bad name?
Well, you just said before that breeding values got a bad rap, well, probably from more the traditional guys. Is that an age thing, or was it because why?
Well, that's the question, I guess, and I guess my take on it is partly fear, like not fear of change, but the fact that things were changing. The fact that I guess some early use of breeding bays. The problem with, well, one of the problems with breeding bays is that you get what you want faster than what you're used to, and so you've got to be really careful to know what you want, because if you select for high growth when the story I've heard a lot is over here is going for high growth in beef cattle and getting big tall cows that couldn't do it on the hill, couldn't have the constitution to keep surviving and calving on the hill, and so breeding bays get blamed, or the tool gets blamed for the outcome, but essentially it's how it was used. So, well, I think there's a whole range. Any change in an industry causes some grief, and I guess in my mind, the quicker we move through that, and I don't think we're going to move through it tonight, but I think the quicker we get into doing what we do best, which is talking about how we breed better sheep, the better we go.
Yeah, so it's probably a lack of understanding somewhat, isn't it?
Well, it's a combination of that. I think what we see and love doing is helping people work through how to apply the tools to their individual outcomes that they're after, because there's certainly obviously different. Some people have big weather flocks and want to grow a lot of wool, and some people don't want any wool at all, and some people want to have cows in really good conditions on the flat, and other people need to run around in the snowgrass. So there's a whole heap of different breeding objectives, and I think that's the important thing. And even today on Twitter, we're chatting about a little bit that there is no sort of one right or wrong. It's about how you apply the principles to your individual circumstances.
Thanks, Vic.
Cheers, mate. So I guess we have the joy of working across a whole heap of types, and I did a rough estimation that it's about 11 to 44 micron across the different breeding programs that we're involved with, and the great thing is that the principles apply regardless of the aim. So we've got so there's Ernst Clue ultrafines there. Some of those sheep are minus 6.5 microns, so some of those sheep only breed 12 micron sheep, through to our Southern Cross breeders that are breeding a fine wool composite, basically, and then some quite, I guess, what you'd think is traditional sort of ultrafine or superfine merinos that are supplying some of the best high quality wool to the Italian factories, through to your sort of traditional meaty pole merino, through to your composite maternals and composite terminals, and then some Hereford and Angus breeders as well. So a whole heap of different types of sheep, different breeding objectives, different outcomes that are desired. And that aim is a really personal thing. It's partly linked to the country, obviously. Some people have places that that are better suited to composite terminal to composite maternal production. Some people have country that you can only run weathers on, so they're running a fine wool merino. A lot of, I guess, the high country places in New Zealand need a combo of cattle and sheep to handle the pasture, and so there's a whole heap of different aims, and I think that isn't up for negotiation. You get to choose. Each individual business gets to choose what they want to do. I guess it's then how you go about applying the tools that decide the pace with which you get to there. So I think the breeding objective, or the type of sheep or the type of cow you want to breed, isn't the discussion. It really is how you apply the best tools you can put together to achieve that outcome. And for some of those outcomes, it's all can be measured. So if you just in a terminal game, apart from obviously structure and making sure they can walk around okay, a lot of what you need can be measured. And some of that's expensive, like IMF and things are a bit expensive to measure, but you can measure that. And then there's other things that you do need subjective assessment of in the wool traits, handling high rainfall, that sort of stuff, and or meeting market specifications, particularly in that spinners type of wool. You need to meet a particular type of wool to actually get that outcome. So there's a combination of what you can see and what you can measure, and I guess how we apply those things together determines how fast we go in terms of genetic gain. Just a comment there from Todd. One criticism I hear is that breeding values have an inbuilt credit or premium for breeders that have used them for longer, even if the animals in the two herds are similar. So yeah, and I hear this quite a bit, that if those that have entered the database early get a free hit essentially, and no one can ever catch up. And it's not the case in terms of, if you go in and you get full pedigree with a couple of generations, you'll have the same accuracy of the breeding values. But the issue is that the people that are using them and have been using them for a long time, it is pretty hard to catch up, because they're making genetic gain at a rate that makes it pretty hard to catch up. The system does obviously reward animals with high accurate data. So the more progeny they've got, the more herds and flocks have been used in the system, will obviously, that will be those breeding values will be higher accuracy and will be and will sort of hold over ones that are just coming in. But I don't think that's a reason to not get in there. We've certainly shifted. I think when we moved to New Zealand, there was 2 or 3 flocks on breeding values in the country. We've now got 20 odd, and a lot of them have animals that are up on the trait leaders list, or in the top 50 for the indexes or whatever. Or not a lot of them, but there's animals in there that are reaching those heights. So they've gone from zero to top of the game, if that's your aim, in 5 or 6 years. So yeah, I think the system the computer can only handle the information you give it, and the more information you give it, the better you go. And the ones that have been doing it the longest know exactly what they're doing. They handle their linkage really well. They handle their candidate selection really well. They're using genomics better than anyone else. So they actually are pretty hard to catch, not because the system gives them a free kick, but because they are actually making genetic gain hard to catch. But thanks, Todd. That's a great question. I guess this is a quote I use a bit, but error is the enemy of genetic gain. So wherever we're making a selection decision and we're not, and some error creeping in, then we're slowing down our genetic gain essentially. It doesn't mean you don't make genetic gain. And some of the wool traits that our forefathers have done a great job of selecting for increasing fleece weight and making it finer and improving the quality all that time. I guess so it's not that you can't make genetic gain, and the same for growth in cattle and everything. You do make genetic gain. It's just slower if you've got some error in there. And as we finish out tonight's talk and lead into Thursday lunchtime's talk, we'll present a couple of graphs that sort of demonstrate how that error can start to build up in your selection decision to essentially slow you down, and where you could be making 2.5%, you end up making 0.5% or 0.25% of genetic gain, which is bugger all in most people's terms. Comment from Carousel, which is true. So it's not the use of the tool, but the quality and commitment to the tool. That's a good comment. That the tool works, but it needs to be used properly for it to be able to differentiate between the good and the bad on each trait. Alan says, another criticism I often hear is that the figures can be doctored to make them look better than they should be. Is there any resource I can use to refute that? I guess it's another one we hear a bit, and it's a great comment, Alan. And the reality is you can get away with 1 year if you pull out a team of rams and do something differently with them in terms of feeding them up. If you could make those individuals look good, if you don't use the tool properly and don't actually enter those contemporary groups properly, you will end up having a negative impact you'll end up making those animals look better than they actually are. I think the beautiful thing in our industry now is that if you do that, there's all these great people out there that are hunting the database, and they'll buy some semen and they'll use those sires, and those animals come screaming back to the pack really quickly, because once you get linkage in there, once they get linked back, then you can't do that forever. You'd have to be the brains of Daniel Brown to be able to keep feeding up the right ones to make sure that your data looked good. Because as soon as you go back into the pack, which is selling semen to somebody, then essentially your animals come screaming back to where they should be. So there has been examples of where bulls and rams have sort of had data that's better than it should be, which is mainly through bad grouping. So if you don't tell the computer that animal's been fed differently, then it can't separate it out. Obviously, there's checks and balances in there a bit, but it can be artificially change. But the reality is that that's a very short-lived thing, and your ability to sell semen or sell rams or bulls after doing that goes through the floor, obviously. So yeah, you can get short-term those sort of impacts, but they don't last very long. And in my career, I've never been they've never lasted very long at all, and those people can come and go pretty quickly. So the ability to trick people. You hear people that won't scan their bulls until they're heavier, or they won't scan their rams until they're older to get better breeding values for carcass traits or whatever. And that's obviously not reality. All the animals just get compared to each other within the flock, and then it's a linkage, the genetic linkage, that brings that all back into the group, which is why they're such a really handy and important tool. Obviously, this is just a made-up graph in terms of the units, but the great thing about genetic gain is the more accurate we are, the more accurate you make a selection decision, the greater that gain can be. And every bit of error you introduce slows down your rate of gain. And so it might be down to 0.25% or 1%. And the great thing about genetics is like compounding interest. If you make some genetic gain this year, you've got more genetic gain to make, or you got a higher number of that trait to make genetic gain on the following year. So it actually compounds. And so the earlier on that 30-year journey you get on to making genetic gain and using animals that are superior than the ones you've got at home, making sure that your generation this year is the worst generation of sheep you'll ever have, or cattle you'll ever have. Next year it'll always be better than that, and the year after will be better than that. Anything you're doing that's bringing in error to that selection decision is slowing you down, essentially. And that's something I see as a massive opportunity for the pastoral industries across Australia and New Zealand, is to really, for their type, for the animal they want to breed, is to get on and use the tools to actually get on the rate of genetic gain, because it's a massive opportunity that can cover a lot of extra cost by having the right sheep, rather than, because I mean, everyone, it's been said a million times that if you're going to feed a sheep, you may as well feed a good one, and it's very, very true. And I think, unfortunately, we've got lots of sheep and cattle out there that aren't at the top of the game, that continue to be fed and are holding back enterprises, which is what I see as a massive opportunity and gets us out of bed every day to help close that gap. So I've got a question there: how important is it to include the whole mob in the data, e.g. removing visual culls and measuring the rest as a cost saver on testing? And this is something that I always have a discussion with our clients, is to try and get as many measured as possible. We're practical in the sense that some will disappear out of that, but we always want, so say they're getting culled at weaning, we'd want a weaning weight, some measurement on them before that happens. So perfect world, and the people that make the most genetic gain carry through everything, even if they've got 3 legs and black spots, they get carried through till measurement. The people that are really committed to it, and that helps. But the reality is some will go out before that. The important thing is that, I guess what I encourage people to do is make sure the last measurement is that those animals are there for, the whole mob gets measured, and so that they can at least contribute that weaning weight or whatever it is, so that their data goes to contribute. Because if you cull a heap of animals from an individual sire and you only keep 3 of them or 5 of them that actually looked all right, then that breeding values for that sire will only know, or the system only knows the measurements from those 5 that you kept, not the 45 that you culled. And so you're having a massive impact on the accuracy of what you're doing. And so all of a sudden you start not believing breeding values because that terrible sire produced a heap of culls, and yet it's saying it's great, but because of ones that you put up and left in the flock were great. And so we have to be really careful that by trying to save money, we don't end up costing us time and money by kicking out those too early. But we're practical, and you can enter the system. Sheep genetics, at least, if you cull an animal, you can keep measuring it, and you don't get charged for implementing that data. So the data gets adds to the breeding value of the sire and the dam and all the other animals in the pedigree, but it doesn't add to, you don't get a breeding value on that cull, but at least its information gets incorporated, which is the whole point, that you would be gathering it. So Ray's asked, what's the best way for commercial breeders to minimise error? And I guess the short answer is to buy bulls and rams with accurate breeding values. So which is I guess what we do, is help people do that process. But that's the point of breeding values really, is to get information in the hands of ram and bull buyers that is accurate enough to make good decisions. So rather than selecting rams without any information at all, having some numbers on those selection decisions is the best thing you can do, and will sit you at a really good. We've seen commercial breeders make amazing rates of genetic gain by really just hunting the data and hunting the rams that suit their type and suit the information and suit the breeding objective, and you can make amazing rates of gain. Daniel's asked, is there any value in spending much effort selecting the ewes in a commercial flock? And we'll cover that towards the end. I think there is, obviously, as we're increasing reproduction, and we've got some really reproductive flocks that are on the call tonight. There's going to be animals that get removed from those flocks because we've just got too many of them. And so, do you just do you do that randomly, or do you try and get some information? And obviously, most of your genetic gain is going to come through what you do on the ram side of things or the bull side of things, but you still get an opportunity to make some select decisions. So culling dries, that sort of thing, but also essentially you're going to have to look at young sheep and make a selection decision. What I'll cover off at the end, or maybe your next call, is to make sure you're not being blinded by phenotypic or by sort of fixed effects in that selection decision, because particularly in sheep, where you've got twins out of maidens and twins out of ewe lambs, you can have a negative impact on. You can select the wrong animals because of what you're looking at. But we'll cover that a bit as we go through. So this is the based genetics, I suppose, and everyone knows this, but the phenotype of what we get to see or measure is a combination of the DNA, the genetics, and the environment. And so that's the climate, the season, how much it was fed, how old it is, how old its mum was, whether it's a single or twin in the case of sheep. So what we're trying to get, the bit that you take home in your flock is genetics, obviously. But what you get to see on sale day when you're buying a ram or buying a bull, or selecting a ram or a bull for your own herd or flock, is this phenotype, and there's more environment or more non-genetic effects in what you're looking at and measuring than there is genetics, and that's what breeding values are amazing at, is separating that bit out. A question there: what's the accuracy value need for positive progress? That depends on the trait. And so basically, if you've got an accuracy, and every trait's got a different accuracy threshold, but if you're getting a breeding value quota, then it's met a threshold. And if you know your breeder, you want to know that they're being measured for that trait if it's important to you, and if they have been, and they've got full pedigree, then it'll meet the accuracy threshold, and you'll make gain on that trait. And I'll cover that. I haven't got time tonight to cover that, all the reasons behind that, but essentially, if you're going to someone who's doing the work, then the accuracy of their breeding values will be sufficient for you to make great gain. Not on every, and it's the accuracy of the team you buy. If you buy 5 rams or a couple of bulls, on average they won't shift in terms of the breeding values you buy them on. Every individual might go up or down as its accuracy improved, but on average you end up with the average of what you take home. So a comment there about commercial sense, you're bolting through a lot of animals, and that's true when you're classing commercially. I guess there's a couple of things we just need to watch out for, which we'll try and cover. And the reality is, when we're looking at a bull or a ram, particularly if we're looking at them across different environments or different studs or different ram sales, most of what we see is not due to genes, whether it rained that year or didn't, whether they were twin, where they are in terms of, so some environments you'll have beautiful white wool. So environmental location is really important, whether they've been housed or not, which is not something that happens in New Zealand, but in Australia, if they've been fed up and stuck in a shed, it's really hard to work out what the genes are doing, how old they are, and then the nutrition. All those things that we see in a bull or a ram, like when we're on sale day, a lot of the things we're looking at are actually not due to genetics. They're due to all these factors that make that animal look that way on the day. Obviously, part of that is genetics, and you can assess some of that, but there's also big chunks that aren't, and that's why I think breeding values are really important to try and separate out the things that we can't see, because we're not there every day with those sale rams. We just turn up on one day to buy that ram or buy that bull, and we're trying to make a judgment between whether I should drive up that driveway or another one, and when I get there, which of those animals I should be taking home. And if all that's in there confusing me, it makes it a really tough decision to try and work it out. And it doesn't matter when you analyse the data. If you look at the end of the bull season, the ones that have sold the best will be the ones that had the heaviest weight, and same in the ram season. People, as humans, we can't stop ourselves going and buying the big shiny ones, and so using some data is a really good way to stop the natural tendency to go and to find the biggest and the broadest and the widest, or whatever the traits that we're interested in. With some data, we can hone down that decision with a lot more accuracy than we can otherwise. Will Murray's asked when are we going to get an EBV for visual traits, and they are there for some visual traits, but and certainly on the CPT that the rams have been in, we've measured or assessed them for those traits. So that's increasing all the time, the number of visual traits that are getting breeding values on them, and I think that's a massive opportunity going forward, and certainly has been. Certainly we're getting more all the time, and the more the merrier. It's amazing when you actually assess something and generate a breeding value for it. It takes out some of that error that we've been talking about. So what's in a breeding value? So really quickly, and a lot of people on the line know this as well as I do, but to get a breeding value on an animal, obviously that trait has to be measured on the animal is ideal. You can get correlated breeding values, but we'll keep it simple. So measurement for that trait. The management group or the nutrition is taken out by the contemporary group. So it only ever, so the animals only ever get compared within their group. So if you feed up that whole group to 100 kilos, that doesn't change the breeding values as if you kept them at 40 kilos, because it's only the relativity between the two that are between the animals in that flock that matter, or in that herd. And so that goes for nutrition and management. That's taken out by making sure animals are treated the same, and the computer knows which animals were treated the same. Age of the animal dam. So obviously the big ones there are your two-tooth or your ewe lambs. So that has a big impact on how the animal performs. Single, twin, or triplet when it comes to sheep. Again, that has a massive influence. We all know that twins grow slower, and a few other things that we'll cover as we close out this talk. Pedigree, that's the critical thing. That's the thing that really separates breeding values from, or enables them to work, essentially, is knowing who the sire is, knowing who the dam is, right back through that pedigree. That's what brings the traits together. That's how you can compare a ram here in North Canterbury with one in Katanning, because of the linkage that we've got, that pedigree, keeping that and knowing that those link size is critical to how it works. Heritability of the trait. So different traits have different heritabilities. So it's the proportion of the variation you see that's due to genes. And so traits like fibre diameter that we've been great at shifting when deciding to, it's sort of depending on the database, but 55 to 60% heritable. So lots of what the variation you see between individuals is due to their genetics. Compare that to some of the growth traits that are around 40%, 35 to 40. And then if you get down to like reproduction traits that are more like 5%, where you've got 95% of the variation is not due to genes, it's due to other factors. And so that has a big impact on the actual breeding value. But the beauty of that is that it's, by the time you're seeing that number on sale day, it's all been accounted for. So you know that if they're plus 15 for number of lambs weaned, then they're plus 15. You're going to get 15 more lambs, or that genetically that's what's going to pass on to the daughters of that ram. And so you don't have to know all this stuff. That's what the breeding value does take into account for you. And the other thing that adds to the accuracy of the breeding value is the correlated trait. So if we know that if it measured pretty good at weaning weight, then it's probably going to be pretty good post-weaning weight. So that gets taken into account. And other things, like we know that fibre diameter and fleece weight are correlated, for example. So all that information gets taken into account to help build the accuracy, so that the number that we get to deal with as ram buyers and bull buyers is the best guess of that data on the day. A bit of a chat about the scoring system there, which I'll let continue on. The thing that underpins all breeding values is the genetic linkage, and this is what the Merino lifetime productivity trial that's underway at the moment is fantastic for, is building up linkage. The sheep CRC was was another resource that really drove great linkage across the industry. Our central progeny test in New Zealand. Yeah, so the MLP site and our central progeny test site in New Zealand has been fantastic at providing linkage. And so this is just an example of a couple of sires that were used in 2 different sites. And so up in the top right-hand corner, you've got sheep that were fed to or were in different conditions, different age, but a lot heavier, cutting a lot more wool. And then you've got another mob of sheep down at Balmoral, the same site, but the 2 different sires were used in the same places. The two same sires were used in both places. And what we see is that they rank exactly the same, although the measurement is completely different. So they're much heavier, they're cutting a lot more wool. But that sire, the blue ringed sire there, is cutting less wool and is heavier in both sites than the yellow sire there. And so that's how linkage works, that sires don't re-rank when you shift the environment. And that enables you, by having those 2 rams in common in those sites, means that you can then compare all the other rams in that site. But there's still some chat on visuals there. So we've got about 10 minutes to run. Just a couple of things here. This is from the central progeny test in New Zealand. This is a fleece weight. All those dots are an individual sire. And this is just the fleece weight breeding value of that sire versus the average of their progeny. Now, those average numbers do have that. So those sire breeding values do have those progeny in their breeding value. So put that caveat in there. So that is influencing that breeding value for the sire, but they also have lots of other progeny in lots of other places. So it's not only influenced by this, but it does help drive that correlation and make it look nicer than it might be otherwise. But a couple of things I wanted to point out. So this is fleece weight. And so what we see there is singles are cutting more wool than twins. So for every individual sire, on most of those sires, you've got singles that are cutting more wool than twins. So if we don't have that breeding value, we might be selecting animals that just have, if we're just selecting on fleece weight without taking that single and twin into account, we're likely to just select single-born animals. And that's for fleece weight. The same thing for fibre diameter, and it goes the other way. So twin-born animals are all stronger than the single-born equivalents for every sire. And that can be half a micron or a micron in individual sire cases. And so again, you're picking out, if you're just going for a fine, heavy cutting animal and you're not using the breeding values, then the chances are that you'll start to, you can end up selecting single-born rams again. So without information, you can accidentally keep buying or selecting single-born animals, and the same goes for growth traits and carcass traits and everything else. You can end up selecting the wrong animals because you're not accounting for single and twin properly. And so that's a follicle thing, and that's what we did with lifetime wool, was to show that nutrition does the same thing. So twins are broader because they have less secondary follicle development, and they cut less wool because they have less secondary development. So it's a double whammy for twins. And if we're just selecting those animals, then in that way, then we can have a negative impact. Another one that we also another thing, same thing, that singles and twin, if you happen to be trying to select for planar body animals, then again singles and twins come into something like to wrinkle score. So this is a sire breeding value for wrinkle, the sire breeding value for wrinkle, and looking at the average of the progeny. And so again, those twin-born animals are planar, less skin development, and therefore having less wrinkle. And I guess when we're actually out there, and this is talking to that classing question, when we're looking at selecting through those ewes, classing through ewes, there's a heap of things that are impacted by what we actually see on that day. And the twin-born lambs are always less appealing in that classing race. So this is something that I think we need to consider as an industry, how we go about selecting those ewes and making sure we're not actually disproportionately culling twins. And we had Bronwyn Clark talk about this at our head shepherd conference. She covered through some of the analysis she'd done on the MLP site in WA, and showed that there was actually a disproportionate number of twins are getting culled because of some of these things. So if we add up the fact that they're broader and they're cutting a bit less wool, and that will be noticeable by a classer, they're a bit lighter, they're a bit, and this is analysis on the left there is analysis I did of a Marinatech database. They're shorter stapled, they're lower luster, lower crimp frequency, lower crimp definition, a bit drier, lower density, blockier staples, less defined, and they have more lambs. But so all of that culminates in when we're actually flying through a group of ewes and we're actually culling them, that we end up accidentally culling more twin-born lambs than we would otherwise. So that's something we need to consider. In my mind, the way we would account for that would be to make sure we're actually commercially tagging twin-born lambs and treating them separately. It doesn't mean you give them a leg up. You just need to make sure you're not classing a twin with a single every time, because as those twins are coming through, you're more likely to kick them out. And obviously the twins from Tudus are the worst in that combination. And when I've classed sheep, and particularly ewes out of ewe lambs or twins out of Tudus, you're more likely to definitely go to cull them and then work out that they're actually a twin out of Tudus, and you might be being a bit harsh. So summing up, I guess the way I think about it, if you can measure it, why would you guess? I think there's a massive opportunity for us as an industry to, regardless of the type of sheep we like to breed or the type of cattle we want to breed, to actually use some data in those decisions, because there is just too much of an opportunity not to, in my mind. And there is a massive opportunity for us to use some information. And it's not about the type. It's not about your breeding objective. It's about how you apply the tools to that objective. So summing up, if we've just launched neXtgen sheep breeding, our online course, it goes into all these aspects in a lot more detail. We've got an introductory price at the moment, which is $180, plus access to 3 more Zoom calls to go through that detail. There's a whole heap of detail that we haven't covered tonight. We'll go through a bit more on Thursday, but there's 4.5-5 hours of information on that online course about helping people, guiding people through those breeding decisions. So if you've done bred well, fed well in the past and are keen to sort of go that next step in your learning journey on that aspect, we'd love to have you along there. We've been really happy to have we've had 6 or 7 now producers who've gone through it as sort of beta testers, and they've been the feedback's been fantastic. We're making a few adjustments this week based on that feedback, and then we're good to go. So that's closing on the 24th of May midnight, that deal. It'll be available after that, but the access to the Zoom calls and the follow-up and that 10% discount will disappear at midnight on the 24th. We've got some of our members on board online tonight, but there's others of you that aren't. We provide weekly information to our members, so they get a newsletter each Sunday, and every fortnight we have one of these Zoom calls. We have an hour with an expert from somewhere across New Zealand or Australia to talk about something that's relevant. So if this forum's important to you, I guess, or has been enjoyable, I think what we're seeing is that obviously people are all over the place, and it's hard for us to all get to field days all the time, and the ability to actually interact in this way has been great. We've had Friday night drinks all the way through the COVID-19 lockdown, which has been great to provide that a bit of a get out for us that are all locked away. You'll have our details by now because you've signed up to this, but love to hear any feedback. We're here again on Thursday middle of the day. Sorry, Will, but going forward we'll shift those around for you. Happy to take questions and sit here as long as people hang around to chat. But thanks very much for your time. I hope you've found that something of use there. Understand that you've taken an hour out of your day, and really appreciate that. And we'd love to hear what you think, or would love to have you be part of some of our options going forward. So if you want to have a chat, unmute and ask any questions, or just head off and get on with the rest of your evening.